Awesome.
Right. Right. Okay. So go ahead.
So I'm sort of interested in knowing how this this literature term that you talked about, this term that you talked about, has it fed back into planning curricula in schools in the US? Because, and I mean, I'm not sure much of that is translated into planning curricula here also. Basically, how are we preparing a new generation of planners that will respond to this?
Thanks.
Yeah. As we study Weber, India can be seen under charismatic leadership now. I mean, how do you see political change influence in the planning process?
Hi, I'm Chetan. I'm a linguist, so I have a scratchy question here. What I want to know is that if we look at planning as a process which sort of orders, a process which state uses, or technology which the state uses to order its societies, then if you bring in law from the other side, there is this sort of correlation between rise of urban area and the rise of planning. There's a correlation between the two. That as in when you plan more things, the areas that you start planning in become more and more urbanized, and that correlation can be understood in one way from the question of how state orders, and that ordering can be looked at from the policing aspect by, say, Walter Benjamin. Other side of it comes from the question of exception, that who decides upon the exception eventually plays a major role in how something is to be planned. You can do something as much as you want to, eventually somebody would have to decide upon where the conflict would happen, and that somebody would have the power. That potentiality of the power comes from the exception. Then how do we sort of bypass these questions, or as long as these questions of exception and ordering would remain, state's role would always remain fundamental in that ordering of the social strata. How do you have some sort of insight into how do we understand this phenomenon from the ground practice perspective?
Thank you for that. Actually, maybe these are just comments. I wanted to make a comment on your smart cities, your take on smart cities. Actually, if you read the various documentations, it's one of the most corporatized, technologized, verging on a kind of urban planning fascism, if I can put it that way.
No plan in that.
In terms of smart cities. Sorry?
There's no plan in that. It's all program.
We need to think carefully about Indian cities which are not corporate entities, not machines. If you're thinking about what Indian cities are about, we can have further discussion, but I'd be interested in kind of a much more problematized idea of what smart cities is. It's not, if this is what Indian cities are need to be planned, then I think we're in deep trouble actually. The other thing is that planning, I live in Gurgaon, I work in Gurgaon. I'm an anthropologist, so I can't really engage at different levels that you presented. But in Gurgaon, planning is the site of deep ad hocism. That's the whole point of planning. The state is deeply implicated in planning because at each step it allows the state to not have any plan. And so it brings together private capital and the state. So the planning has not moved away from the state primarily because planning is the site where formality of the form allows you to operate in a completely informal manner. And that is the relationship between the state and capital. So it's not that I agree with you, that planning is really important and it works. But in the Indian context, the manner in which, for example, the buffer area for forest areas are changed, the manner in which right from 1979 onwards when DLF starts building Gurgaon, and the deep relationship between the state and the private planners through planning documents is to precisely have an entirely ad hoc urban mechanism. It has nothing to do with a plan mechanism. I think we need to think about what we mean by the relationship between the formal and informal, because that boundary in the Indian context is completely blurred. Because the state itself is not a monolith. It is not the state itself consists of different interests that people have. Different political parties have. And I think unless we think of planning as a deeply politicized process in any country, I don't think there's any it seems to me, a socially complex way of understanding it. It's like saying that attacks on Africans in Delhi is a police and law and order problem. Planning is not, I think, a law and order.
I think there were one more question here.
Thanks for the talk, Professor. I had a question about, you're saying that planning is not about defining and controlling, but it's more about adapting. So in Delhi's case, if the Delhi government is not going to plan out its open spaces, aren't they going to be taken up by informal settlements like they have been in the past many years? Doesn't it need to define which spaces are reserved for informal settlements and which would never be given to informal settlements? And if it is just going to be adapting in future, isn't it just becoming a reactive process rather than a proactive process?
Costly. Costly.
So there's a lot.
On the table.
Yes, there's a lot on the table. But just as since Delhi is coming up so much, on the DDA MCD story, it's an interesting story, and then maybe you can add to that. MCD doesn't really provide any services, so apart from picking up the trash. But the broader question is that the agencies for services, which is AJB for water and sanitation, PWD for the road, etc., are at a separate level, not just separate agencies, which is there in almost all countries, a separate level of government from the level of government which is actually doing the work. Because DDA is a feature of the federal government, the service agencies are features of the state. NCT, government of the NCT, calling it a state government to start another discussion, so not going to that space. And so it's one of the issues my query will be as to whether this might be part of the story as to why we're getting what we're getting. But anyway, so let me not, just a commentary on this sort of in that way. Please.
All right, so I'll come to Mukhtar's question towards the end of the curriculum. But I want to take Sanjay's question and the question about conception of planning as a site where the state sort of orders stuff spatially and decide who gets what and when and where. I think this is planning has been used for a variety of purposes. So it's absolutely a political enterprise the way it plays out. What I was referring here to as to what the conception of planning is, right? How does a society conceives what it wants and where it wants and how it wants to achieve that goal? Perhaps the best planned economy in the state was fascist Nazi Germany, right? Everything was spatially organized, worked with military precision, including killing of millions of people, very industrially organized, right? From collection of live people to disposal of dead bodies, right? So you can use planning in many ways. Nehruvian planners imagined they would be using it in a certain way, and similarly did politicians of Haryana through the last 20 years, how this would be planned. Of course, the literature is full of that kind of planning. And if we were to critique planning, we would have more books than this room itself to talk about the failures of planning. That is nothing new to me. What is new? Can we conceive of planning as targeting the common good? Planning is not about private gains or private goods pursued in the name of public welfare. I am talking about common good, like air quality, like water quality, like municipal services that everyone gains from. And that's where the focus and the locus of the planning should be. And if we can think of bringing these different kinds of plan together in a productive way, that's the kind of planning we envisage, right? I think it's a fundamental shift. Planners historically had thought about using state power to control and shape and govern. And we know mostly for private gains, either in the name of public good or either directly in the name of capitalism. That's old story. I mean, can we reconceive planning? While all these I showed you the population shifts, right, across the globe, and the social and political and the economic changes going on. It's a dynamic, fluid situation. And that's why planning is important, and if we can do it cleverly and diligently, I think the outcomes would be better than what could happen otherwise. Mukta's question, I find it interesting. We, at our own school, we restructured the core curriculum of the Master of Urban Planning degree using this conception of planning to teach a required core course called Plan Make. And we use the similar set of literature to sort of look at. I'll be happy to share an article that we published on it. So it's beginning to be adapted, but the mainstream legacy of post-war planning is mostly full of follies and a lot of unanticipated outcomes, right? So it's a shift. Shifts usually take longer, much longer than single human lives, and the bad legacies live on for a long period of time. But yes, there is some discussion around the curriculum there. Other questions?
Can you actually sort of adaptation and anticipation versus?
Yeah, sorry, I overlooked that question. So that's an important one, right? It is, I think within the Indian context, at this point in time, the most powerful planning actor is the court. The courts increasingly define and control where you can build. For example, it's clear, though there is no rule or legislative act, but courts have said no building on water bodies or environmentally sensitive areas. And that's something that is followed through, right? So the define, unfortunately, and that's why planning as an activity is defined by the context and the legacy of a particular place. So I believe at this point in time, the most legitimate and centralized actor is actually the judicial process, which is defining and controlling, rather than the state plans. State plans, increasingly we find them playing much less role than we imagine, or the state acts imagine them to be playing. We know private plans are beginning to emerge, informed often by the political process and larger social shifts, including the promotion of private capital accumulation in this country. So I think, and I didn't talk about judicial plans that's a altogether different reality to talk about. But that's where I think defining and controlling is happening. Should it be happening at that end? I don't think that's a good idea in a democratic polity. But unless we figure out how we need to plan this country, it's a larger question, right? It's not only for the planners to take to sort of decide. It's a much larger question where this should. That's the venue where this question should emerge. How and to what extent code should be playing a role.
The question on Babelian charisma.
Can I have a follow-up? Just one.
Sure.
But who would be the negotiating body between different levels of government? If the MCD has its own plan versus the DDA versus the state, where would they all meet, and who would decide, who would arbitrate?
Now this is, there's several ways in which different countries sort of do it. In the US, the context I'm most familiar with, we have a regional plan which is mostly suggestive in nature, right? It paints a broad picture and talks about plausible scenarios. It is the local areas, the villages and towns. So Chicago region, for example, have more than 200 political jurisdictions, cities and towns and villages, ranging from 30,000 population to 70,000, 80,000. And they make their plans that they follow through. The master plans in that tradition do not have legal backing. It's the zoning that have the legal backing, and that's at the city hall politics. So the MCDs of these smaller places where this planning happens. In the French tradition, this would be more state-led, but then the state itself, as Sanjay pointed out, in most of the world, is driven by different interests and actors that have a stake in it. So citizens' participation, right? Your alderman and your local councillor and the mayor is the person within which and within their purview this kind of an activity would take place. I think 73rd and 74th Amendment was a very positive step forward, and if we were to actually do ward level planning, that would be a much wanted improvement than having a central city level master plan. So ward level planning, this is an old idea. Planners have been asking for it for many years. But maybe that's the scale where the allocational decisions get made, and that's where we reconcile, right? So each municipality sort of sees how does it make sense of the higher level plan. There are issues with that too. People do not want locally wanted, unwanted land uses. No smaller area wants a garbage dump, for example. Right? We know it usually goes to Yamuna Par, but then Yamuna Par would not want it in sometimes, right? So that's the question. That's where regional plans become important, because then you're looking at regional level land uses and making decisions like that. So that scale is important, and ward seems to be the key here, though I haven't seen very definitive studies and plans made at that level here in India. Aapka ek, can we quickly, among all these questions, I just lost track of. No. That's a brilliant question. The way I sort of see the connection here is that across political party lines there is a growing recognition that urban areas are important. Whatever party might be in power, or this is true as much for the states as it is for the center. How would different changes in political regime play out? I am not so sure. But I definitely see a trend that cities are going to gain more traction at the central and state level policy making. And this, whether it would play out in a corporate style, as Sanjay pointed out, it would be bad for everyone. If it plays out in a more inclusive, distributive, equitable manner, better it would be for everyone. Future is difficult to anticipate, and planners usually deal with future-oriented questions. That's why planning is tricky business, right? 20 साल पहले यहाँ बजाज स्कूटर की लाइन थी. अगर हम 20 साल पहले किसी को समझाने की कोशिश करते कि हीरो ने कि होंडा कार वाले आपके घर में आएंगे कि सर प्लीज 0% इंटरेस्ट पे ले लो, people would have laughed it, right? So future is 20 years out, extremely difficult to anticipate. I do not know how would it play out in 20 years out. I hope we breathe much better air, we have access to better transport, and so on and so forth. And that future-oriented, hopeful, common good, I think, is the focus. And that's where planning, if done well, does okay. Rather than only doing it for private purposes or select public gains. I hope that helps.
Just a small comment on the smart issue. That the society
If we just turn on the microphone, yes.
the society is so fragmented and there's so much of conflict. It's not a really homogeneous, even at a ward level. That is creating a lot of problems and conflicts of interest between spontaneous settlements and the richer and others. It's difficult to get them on one platform. So that itself is, not such an easy task. I mean, some of the exercises which have been done. The second is that land has become a very contested. I mean, everybody wants access. I mean, including the poor, it's not only the rich people, but everybody wants more and more, as much as you can. So this is creating very difficult, thin line between, what should be controlled, what should not be controlled, who should be really taken care of. So, some of the examples of ward level local area plans, or where the RWAs are involved, is too much of conflict between RWAs.
And the poor.
Yeah, who are, all shades of people, because ward is not a really homogeneous, spatial segregation is too much. People have built walls around the gated communities. They don't want anybody else.
and there was a question on correlation of urban and planning, but I'll ask him to briefly.
Yeah, so the question there was that how do we understand this relationship planning has with this question of who decides on the exception. We can plan something perfectly till the point there is not a conflict. It's only when a conflict arises somebody has to take a decision. That decision is where who has the power is revealed. That is the relationship between law, planning and state, which has say the evidence for that is the rising urbanism that is taking place in our times. That wherever you come up with planning, you would find that state becomes the region goes from rural to urban, because the relationship between law and exception works that way. In practice, in theory we've read a lot about it, we can read Agamben, Walter Benjamin, one says, but in practice I was interested to know how do we handle this question of the exception? Is there a way to work around it, or is it an intrinsically flawed criteria of planning itself, and there's no way to get around it?
Depends on the way we conceive planning, right? If we conceive planning as a state-centered law, framed by a law of the land exercise, then this would happen. It's a great question to be tackled in an anthropological paper. Not such a good question to tackle when you are conceiving planning as a future-oriented exercise. हमें planning करने की कोई ज़रूरत नहीं. सीरिया में इस वक्त लोग खुद plan बना रहे हैं और अपने हिसाब से अपना exceptionalism justify कर रहे हैं, right? So we've seen completely lawless places like Somalia, and then we have extremely well planned, right? Centers, state-led, exceptional, like China, right? Where state decides the moment of exceptionalism. I think India needs to, and that was the pitch, that if we sort of start focusing on the common good, the moment here has not been as ripe since independence, where center has begun to give money, people recognize that there are different kinds of planning. We are not removing all informal plans just by de facto. We realize that there is a plurality of planning taking place, right? And within that, we need to conceive of planning as whether, and it's like a democratic question. How do we define what's the moment of exceptionalism? We can trust the bureaucrat to do it. We can trust the politician to do it. People would figure out a way to do it, right? So it's that kind of conception of planning which I think is important.
Do you think the last categorization, informal plans, like informal planning, it needs to be kind of categorized further or like researched further, because kind of there's an intelligence and there's a whole hierarchy, and in terms of agencies that plan out like at an informal level as well, like there are like kind of humanitarian planning agencies, like there are RWAs, there are individual groups planning out like futures of their areas. So do you think like there needs to be kind of some categorization there as well?
This is a great question. I think of two broad categories there. One is completely ungoverned land grabs that sort of also find their way into what I broadly paint as informal modes of planning. And on the other hand is more organic, ground stuff, people-oriented stuff. That's the broadest criteria. At some point in time, somebody needs to say that this is not acceptable. That's the moment of exceptionalism in my mind. That you cannot grab government land for private gains. And that's the moment where you define this is what park is, this is what a river is. You cannot build on the river plain. So sure, but the broader idea here is thinking of informal, spontaneous, unanticipated plans, and that's critical both for two important reasons. One are formal planning frameworks, because of their colonial and post-colonial legacy, have not provided space for other modes of planning. And second, many of our planning ideas and concepts are imported from the West. Some would say even the idea of colonial planning sort of came with the colonizers, right? So that conception of planning at some point in time needs to be repurposed and rethought And that's where I think once that begins to happen, we would begin to theorize and understand and incorporate spontaneous and informal and tacit plans more rigorously and more intelligently in the planning process.
Christine, do you see any questions behind me? So I think we are. But before I get this close, I was just wondering about the discussion of Chandigarh came up, and you're painting a vision of planning that's, I was just telling Sanjay, almost Polanyian. It's never movement kind of structure. But the politics of that kind of colonial planning is, whether it's possible or not possible, is something that will remain open question. But let's ask a more mundane one. So Chandigarh roughly, could agree or disagree on whether or not we like what Chandigarh has turned out to be, but it basically went from 0 to 10 lakhs in about 60 years. Naidu wants to take Amravati from 0 to 60 lakhs in 10 years. At that pace, can you plan? 0 to 10 lakhs in 60 years may be possible to plan. Can you plan for something that is moving from nothing to 6 million? What's the feasibility? Do we have the tools for it? How much of this can be anticipated? And how much of this can be this wonderful oxymoron that you're pointing, which is spontaneous plan? So, how do you think Shenzhen sort of is about the only city I know of which moved at that pace in that kind of time. And there's an open question of how much planning happened there and not there. I'm assuming it's not there. You might have more than that. If I have an issue, you're asked to take a position. If you were the planner from that, what kind of institutions would you be looking in that would be able to respond to that kind?
I think the multiplicity of this is also you realize that you're putting me a little bit of spot here, and that's all right. I haven't thought through this, but my sense and my fieldwork sort of an understanding of Indian planning alerts me that unless it's an inclusive, right, which pays attention to different kinds of plan making that we know happens, unless that venue or institution or those arrangements take care of all four of these and provide them space to play, it might not be very different from Chandigarh, right? The trajectory of the city, that you would have a formal city and at the same point in time. So one of the things my field will reveal, as soon as the state begins to make a planned neighborhood, an informal one starts right off the bat at the same point in time, and they grow together. So any formally planned neighborhood in any Indian city, and you go back to it 20, 30 years later, you find an informal settlement right next to it, usually of the same vintage. So if we did not do it, I do not see any reason why Amravati, there would not be an informal Amravati, either distributed spatially around it or within it, juxtaposed at the same time. It beats my imagination that it would not happen. But if we can figure out a clever way to make space for different kinds of plans, that might be the solution. And I would sort of stop at that. But 20 years out, 10 years out, still remains difficult to predict, right? 10 years ago, folks could have imagined that everyone would have a smartphone. You were still playing 16 rupees a minute on that chunky phone that you could have probably used as a mud hammer, right? So 10 years out, I do not know. But nonetheless, this should hold true, that there is increasingly a multiplicity of plans, under-theorized, but that's what's happening. That's what my work reveals to me. And as Mukul rightly pointed out, this needs to be theorized more. So I was sharing sort of the preliminary findings from my ongoing research, but I think that's where the answer to this lies. States plans would remain important, but they would have to create anticipate and involve non-state actors? Do we do it for private gains, public, in the name of public welfare, and so on and so forth? But 10 years would be interesting to see what comes out of it.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Thank you, all of you, to be here and participate in the workshop. So we will see you again for the next workshop last Tuesday of next month. Which date is it precisely? And I think we already know 28th of June. So thank you again, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
I'd also like to tell you that most of our talks are recorded and available on the CPR website as videos. You just have to find the CPR-CSH Urban Workshops page, and we also live tweet most of the content, so you can spread the word on that. So, thank you.
So, I think we are good.